Hello everyone, I'm so glad you're here. Tonight, I'm here to help you unwind, slow down, and let your thoughts drift gently into sleep. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and I'm honored to be part of that quiet moment in your evening. So before we begin, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. Now, get comfortable. Close your eyes and let's begin. Let's start with what? When I was 7 years old, my parents divorced, and the world I had known up to that point slowly unraveled into a quieter, colder version of itself. My older brother was 9 at the time, and the court gave our mother full custody of us both. Our dad, though loving in his own distant way, became a visitor in our lives, showing up every other weekend while the rest of the days belonged to our mother. She worked as a waitress, tirelessly without pause, and because the work was inconsistent, money was always tight. We moved frequently, not out of desire but necessity, as eviction notices forced us to uproot again and again, each new home becoming less a sanctuary and more a stopgap in a long game of survival. Eventually, when I was around 10, we found ourselves living in a house that seemed too good to be true. It was large compared to the cramped apartments and basement suites we'd known before, and oddly cheap for its size. It was nestled in a rougher part of town, where streetlights flickered and sirens sang lullabies to those who could manage to sleep through them. But we were grateful. At least for a while. There was something unsettling about the place that I couldn't quite explain. At first it was little things. The television in the living room would turn on by itself, its screen suddenly flooding the dark with flickering light and static hiss. Sometimes it happened just as we were drifting off to sleep on the couch, which my brother and I did often. One night, I was so annoyed that I unplugged the TV, only to hear it come back on moments later. It was still unplugged. Then the windows began tapping. It started one night while I was lying in bed, not quite asleep, but fading into that quiet liminal space between consciousness and dreams. I heard it clearly, 2 soft taps, like someone gently pressing the pad of a finger against the glass. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a branch. It was deliberate. I bolted into my brother's room, trying to explain what had just happened, practically pleading with him to let me stay. He nodded and pulled back the covers. We lay there in silence, wide-eyed, until it happened again. 2 soft taps, now on his window. Neither of us spoke. We just ran to our mother's room, crying and desperate. She was groggy and irritated until she heard it too. A knock, identical to the others, on her own window. She didn't say anything else after that. She just pulled us into her bed. There were other moments too, strange and quiet, but unmistakably wrong. One summer morning while our mum was at work, my brother and I played a game of hide-and-seek tag. He ran outside and I chased him, giggling, but when we tried to come back in, we discovered the door was locked. Not the doorknob, the deadbolt. A lock that could only be turned from inside. We banged on windows, shouted, circled the house trying to find a way in. Her boyfriend, sleeping in the back room, never stirred. For hours we waited outside until our mother came home, confused and upset, unable to explain how we had been locked out from within a house that should have been empty. The strangeness seeped into our sleep. My mother said there were nights she awoke to the sound of my brother screaming for her, only to find his room empty because we were at our father's that weekend. It happened more than once. She began to sleep lightly, always on edge. Then came the night of the crash. Around 3 a.m, we all woke to the sound of something shattering in the storage room. Tiptoeing out of our bedrooms, we found our Christmas ornaments, once packed neatly into plastic tubs, scattered and broken across the carpeted floor. We had no pets, no drafts, no reason to explain how sealed tubs toppled over and shattered fragile glass. The house was still. The silence felt heavier than usual. The final event that pushed us to leave the house didn't even happen to us directly. While we were away on vacation, one of my mother's friends agreed to house sit. He was a kind man without a permanent home, often staying on friends' couches. It seemed like the perfect arrangement. He'd get a place to sleep for a few days, and we'd have peace of mind knowing someone was watching the house. Halfway through our trip, my mum got a text from him. "I'm sorry, but I can't stay here anymore," she called immediately. Concerned, he explained that he had been sitting on her bed, the bedroom door slightly ajar, when he heard a noise in the hallway. Looking through the crack, he saw a little girl in a white dress, staring back at him. At first, he thought it was his imagination. He got up and opened the door only to see her dart away, giggling like she was playing a game. She ran down the hallway and disappeared into the storage room. He described her as not afraid but mischievous, as if she were inviting him to follow. That was enough for him. He packed his bag and left without another word. We never saw him again. When my mother told us what he said, she was visibly shaken. It wasn't just a strange story, it was the final confirmation that whatever lived in that house was real, and it didn't care who was watching. Shortly after we moved, my mother didn't want to stay another night, and neither did we. We packed what we could and left that house behind. But curiously, we still know the family who lives there now. They've mentioned odd occurrences, flickering lights, shadows at the edge of their vision, but they never go into detail. Maybe they're trying to ignore it, or maybe they're too afraid to give it a name. Don't pry. I don't want to know. What I do know is this: sometimes a house doesn't need bloodstains on the walls or doors that slam shut to be haunted. Sometimes it's quieter than that. Subtle. A flickering television. A window knock that never has a source. A giggle in the hallway when no child lives in the home. And sometimes, the scariest things are the ones that follow no pattern, obey no logic, and vanish before you can prove they were ever there. I'm just grateful we got out when we did. It's sorry too. My uncle used to tell me stories that made the hairs on my arms rise, but none unsettled me quite like the one about my grandmother's house. According to him, that place had always been a magnet for the strange and unexplainable. He spoke of shadows that darted across the hallway when no one was there, and pots clanging in the kitchen at midnight, waking everyone up with a chaos that vanished before anyone could find its source. The house wasn't ancient or decrepit. It looked like any other suburban home. But as he would say, evil doesn't always need creaking floorboards and peeling paint to make itself known. The most chilling moment my uncle shared happened one night while he was making a late dinner around 10. As he prepared a snack, he asked his daughter, my little cousin, if she wanted anything to eat. From the living room, down the hall, he heard a faint but clear yes. Smiling, he started preparing her food, and once it was ready, he called out again, offering to bring it to her. Another soft yes. He walked down the hall and into the living room, only to find her sound asleep on the couch, completely still, her chest rising and falling in the slow rhythm of deep sleep. He woke her gently, asking if she'd been talking to him, and she looked up groggily, confused, and said no. She hadn't said a word. She had been asleep the whole time. That story alone might have been enough to unsettle most people, but I didn't truly understand the fear until I stayed there myself. One evening, my cousin and I decided to sleep over at our grandmother's house to keep her company. After a bit of late-night conversation and a cigarette break outside, we headed in to settle down. He went upstairs to the guest room, while I chose the couch downstairs in the living room. The soft hum of the TV became my only company, flickering in the darkness as I drifted into a half-sleep. Everything was still until I began to hear something strange. Whispers, low, quiet voices coming from the direction of the kitchen. The whispers were too distinct to be the hum of the refrigerator or the wind brushing against the house. They were layered, like multiple voices overlapping in urgent conspiratorial tones. I was lying on the couch, which faced away from the hallway that led to the kitchen, and at first I thought maybe my cousin had come down for something. But the voices didn't stop. In fact, they grew clearer as I sat up. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew they were voices, too many of them for it to be one person. My curiosity and fear wrestled in my chest, but eventually I stood and slowly walked toward the kitchen. The closer I got, The louder the whispering became, almost as if I was stepping into the middle of a hidden conversation. But the second I stepped fully into the kitchen, the sound stopped. Just like that. Silence. It was as if the house had swallowed the noise whole, leaving nothing behind but the soft echo of my own breathing. I stood there for a long moment, listening, unsure whether I'd imagined it. But I hadn't. I knew what I'd heard. Still, I searched the kitchen, then the hallway, the guest rooms, anywhere the voices could have come from. All of them were empty. Eventually, I shrugged it off and turned to return to the couch. Halfway down the hall, the whispers returned. This time they were behind me, not in front. My feet froze. I didn't dare turn around. I just stood there in the hallway, listening to those voices rise again, speaking in that same unintelligible but unmistakable tone. I turned back around toward the kitchen again, and silence. Gone, just like before. I stood rooted in place, my heart pounding in my chest and a chill creeping up my arms. Was I imagining this? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me in the stillness of night? I didn't think so, but even if it was, it felt real enough to make my body respond with fear. I decided not to look behind me again. Whatever it was, hallucination or haunting, I didn't want to see it. I walked back to the couch without turning my head, grabbed the remote, and turned up the TV's volume. I forced myself to lie down and stare at the screen, refusing to let my eyes drift toward the hallway. Eventually, exhaustion overpowered fear, and I fell asleep to the quiet drone of late-night infomercials. When morning came, the fear that had gripped me all night lingered, like a fog that hadn't fully lifted. At breakfast, I told my grandmother and cousin what had happened. I expected them to laugh or shrug it off, but instead they just nodded quietly. My cousin told me it wasn't the first time he'd heard whispers in that house. My grandmother didn't even seem surprised. She simply sipped her coffee and said, "That's why I always sleep with the TV on." It was as though they had learned to live with the strangeness, accepting it as just another quirk of the house, like a creaky door or a leaky faucet. Their calm unsettled me more than their fear would have. Even now, years later, I can still hear those whispers in my mind when I lie awake at night. I don't know what caused them, and I don't know why they stopped when I turned around. But I do know that something was in that house with us, something that didn't want to be seen, but wanted to be heard. I haven't stayed there since. I don't think I ever will again. Some houses carry stories in their walls, and I've decided it's better not to listen too closely. Third story. When I was around 11 years old, I began to suffer from recurring nightmares, vivid, disturbing dreams that haunted me night after night. The pattern was always the same. The dreams would start peacefully, almost joyfully. I would be playing outside or enjoying a family gathering, surrounded by warmth and laughter. But just as the feeling of happiness reached its peak, the dream would shift. Abruptly, the air would fill with a heavy, vibrating bass hum, and the people around me would change. Their faces would twist with fear. The joy would turn into primal panic, as if something ancient and unspeakable had entered the space. I would fall to the ground, sobbing, covering my eyes as screams filled the air, horrible, raw screams. The scene would dissolve into chaos. I never saw what caused it, but I felt it, and that was worth. Each time, after the sound of slaughter faded, I would hear the sound of small feet running, not fast, not menacing, but playful, like a child playing hide and seek. Then, silence. Silence so complete it felt like the dream had stopped. And then, I'd hear it. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, padding toward me from behind. They would stop just 3 feet away. Every time. I never turned around. I couldn't. Then a voice would speak, softly but clearly, saying something new each night. One night it was, "Is it Sunday yet?" Another, "Sorry, I'm busy." The voice was strange, deep and scratchy like an older man trying to sound like a child, playing at innocence with something sinister just beneath the surface. It gave me chills that followed me into waking life. These nightmares continued for months, not every night, but often enough that I began to dread falling asleep. I was already a sensitive kid, easily scared by horror movies, even cartoons that had too much violence. I remember my siblings tried to get me to watch Family Guy once, thinking the crude humor would make me less jumpy. But the chicken fight scene terrified me. It was too bloody, too aggressive. I ran from the room. So when these dreams began to follow me into my days, I didn't know how to cope. I became quieter, more paranoid. The dreams didn't turn me into someone else exactly, but they carved something into me, something deep and wary. Eventually the nightmares became less frequent. I don't remember them stopping completely, just fading, like a storm that finally tires itself out. Life went on. I grew older, but the fear they left behind never really disappeared. I stopped talking about them, thinking maybe I had imagined it all. Until, years later, something happened that dragged all those memories back into the light. I was older then, maybe 18 or 19, living with my mum in a modest apartment. I had gone to see a movie with 3 friends, and afterward invited them over to hang out. We were tired, laughing, half watching a paranormal documentary as we lounged on my bedroom floor. We were in the middle of making fun of the ghost hunters on screen when I heard something strange, my mum calling my name. At first I ignored it, thinking she needed something from the other room, but she called again. I paused the show and shouted, "What, Ma?" No answer. I got up, walked toward the hallway calling louder. Still nothing. My annoyance grew as I stepped toward her bedroom, ready to tell her to stop messing around, but then I heard a sound that froze me. A low, wet growl from the bathroom. The kind of guttural noise no human should be able to make. At that moment I remembered my mother wasn't home. She had gone to Chico for the night. My stomach dropped. The house, which had just been filled with laughter and light, suddenly felt darker. I turned to my friends and they were smiling nervously, assuming my mum was just messing with us. But then the voice spoke again, loud enough for all of us to hear. "Tonight, I'll pick you up. Then I'll rip you in half. Rob will know. But no. How? Forget, the voice didn't even sound real. It was a garbled mess, like multiple people speaking through one mouth. My friends looked at me in stunned silence. I didn't wait for a vote. I ran. I slammed the front door open and rushed into the street, my heart thundering in my ears. My friends followed seconds later, confused and terrified. I called my mother, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She told me to call the police, so I did. They came, did their sweep of the apartment, found nothing. They said it might have been a neighbor or the pipes or a television. Anything but what I knew it really was. I wanted to believe them, to shove the fear back down where it had lived for years. But I couldn't. The voice I heard was the same voice from my childhood nightmares. I knew it as well as I knew my own. That night, I tried to sleep, but couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that familiar hum begin to build, the bass, the creeping fear. I forced myself awake each time I drifted off, gasping for breath. I turned on every light in the room. I told myself over and over, "You're awake, you're safe." But it didn't help. I stayed up most of the night, and for the next week, I barely slept at all. I kept the TV on and locked my door. I jumped at every sound, but the voice never came back. What unsettled me most wasn't just that something had returned from my dreams, it was that others heard it too. My friends, sitting just feet away, heard the same twisted voice I had once believed was all in my head. They tried to play it off afterward, saying it was creepy but probably nothing, but I could tell they were shaken. My best friend had planned to stay the night, but suddenly his mum called him, saying he needed to come home at midnight. We never talked about it again. To this day, I don't know what it was. A hallucination? A spirit? a memory so strong it forced itself into the real world. All I know is that it came back for a moment, just long enough to remind me that it was real, that it had always been real, and that somewhere just beyond the edge of waking, it was still waiting, still whispering, still playing hide and seek in the dark. Fourth story. I'm 19 years old and live in the UK. Until recently, I was a complete skeptic when it came to the supernatural. Ghosts, demons, paranormal experiences, all of it felt like fiction to me, something conjured by imagination or sleep-deprived minds. I could always rationalize it. A strange noise, just the wind. Shadows, trick of the light. I prided myself on my logic. But what I've come to learn is that belief doesn't always protect you from experience. Sometimes, the unexplained doesn't wait for your permission. It just arrives, quietly, suddenly, and it changes how you see everything. In my case, it began not with ghosts, but with something far stranger, aliens, or, more precisely, the deep, paralyzing fear of them. I'd always been uneasy about the idea of grey aliens, the ones with the bulbous heads, the massive black eyes and no emotion. It wasn't a dramatic fear. I could read about them. I even found the subject fascinating. But whenever I thought about seeing one in person, a sharp dread filled my chest. Not fear like you feel in a dark alley, but a soul-level unease, like some part of me knew to stay away. I could never sleep facing open windows or dark corners. I always needed sound. White noise, a fan, something to distract my brain long enough to drift off without falling into deep thoughts. That was my protection, until the night that changed everything. About 3 months ago, I had my first night terror. My dad had them growing up, but his were almost comedic. He once screamed that his mum's eyes were glowing neon. Mine wasn't funny at all. In the dream, I was lying in bed with my girlfriend, just like in real life. Everything was identical. My clothes, the curtains, even the position of the bed sheets. The only thing that stood out was the slightly open curtain. I could see through the narrow gap to the outside. I wasn't scared at first, just uncomfortable, like I didn't want to look. But then I saw it. There was a face, right in the gap of the curtain, dead center, staring at me. It didn't blink. It didn't move. It just hovered there, peering in. And it wasn't human. The shape was wrong. Long and tapered like a slice of pizza, rounded at the top and narrowing down to a point. Its eyes were huge and black, voids that swallowed light. They didn't twitch or shift, but they were watching me. I could feel it. My heart started to pound in the dream, and somehow the fear seeped into my real body. I began to hyperventilate, not just in the dream, but in bed. My girlfriend had to shake me awake because I was gasping for air. I woke up with the image burned into my eyes. I wanted to dismiss it as just a bad dream, but something about it didn't feel dreamlike. It felt too real, too vivid. Ever since that night, weird things started happening around the house. Things I could no longer brush off as coincidence. My family had mentioned things before. Curtains moving on their own, the dogs staring at empty corners, flickering lights. But I'd always rolled my eyes. Now, I started noticing it too. Items would fall without explanation. Books placed fully on a table would crash to the floor, despite no one being nearby. The Wi-Fi would constantly fail in my room, no matter how many extenders we used. One night, we all heard a loud bang downstairs. It sounded like a gunshot, sharp, sudden, and so loud it startled the pets. But when we ran down, nothing had moved. No objects had fallen, no doors had slammed. Everything was exactly in place. Our cat began acting strangely too, staring at things that weren't there. Its eyes dilated to unnatural size as it tracked something across empty rooms. Then the knocking began. It was always at the back door, which was made entirely of glass. The kind of door where, if someone were knocking, you'd see them immediately. But when we'd look, nothing. just the empty yard. The strangest moment came after one of those knocks. I'd gone back upstairs, annoyed but trying to ignore it. The hallway light was broken, so it was completely dark, and my bedroom door was shut. I was just about to turn on my console when a bright blue flash filled the hallway. It was like someone had turned on a stadium-grade flashlight just outside my door. Except my door was closed, and no one was there. It wasn't a lightning. It wasn't a bulb blowing. It was a flash, powerful and pure, like it came from nowhere. I froze, unsure whether to open the door or stay put. I chose to stay. My parents didn't believe me at first, but then things started happening to them, too. My mum swore she saw a man looking at her through the living room doorway, but when she turned, he was gone. My sister and my brother's girlfriend had the exact same dream on the same night, talking to two identical girls who sat silently by their beds. My brother began to feel watched. He said he'd see something move just past the corner of his vision. At first we all tried to ignore it, but over time the house felt heavy, like something was building, like something was waiting. I've tried to rationalize it, to return to that safe place of disbelief. I've considered sleep paralysis, mass hysteria, even electromagnetic interference, but none of it fits. And I keep thinking about that dream, about those eyes. I've never seen anything so empty and so knowing. It wasn't just a dream. It was a memory that hadn't happened yet. I don't know what it means. I don't know what's out there, but every time I close my eyes, I feel it waiting. Just beyond the window, behind the curtain, watching. Fifth story. I was around 13 years old at the time, and my life was shaped by quiet routines and the gentle resilience of a single mother raising two kids. My parents had separated when I was younger, and my mum, ever determined and strong, found work cleaning office buildings to provide for me and my sister. She was thorough in everything she did. Cleaning wasn't just a job to her. It was an act of care, of order, a way to make sense of a world that often felt unpredictable. She'd bring us along to help, and over time, scrubbing floors and wiping windows became just another part of our lives, as familiar as school or dinner. There were 3 buildings she cleaned regularly, and we gave them nicknames. The main building, the red building, and the brick building. The red building was the one I always hated going into. It looked ordinary from the outside, but something about it drained the joy from me the moment I stepped inside. The air felt heavier. The colours seemed dimmer. It was like the building itself exhaled sadness. We hadn't been there in a while, but one night we had to clean all 3. As usual, we started with the red building, and this time there was a bathroom in the surveillance room that needed extra attention. That room had always been locked before. I had never seen it from the inside. My sister and I were curious when we entered and saw a wall of monitors showing live security footage from different rooms in the building. It was like being inside a control center. We had a little fun, making faces in front of the cameras, laughing as one of us stayed in the surveillance room and the other ran into the hallway to wave at the screen. But the fun was brief. Our mother reminded us we had work to do. After an hour of mopping, dusting and vacuuming, we were almost finished. My mother was in the kitchen, preparing water for the last round of cleaning, and my sister hovered nearby. My limbs ached, and all I wanted was to go home. Mum gave me a choice. Either mop the kitchen or go upstairs and turn off all the lights. I was so tired that the idea of mopping felt unbearable, so I chose the lights. The upstairs was a maze of hallways and old rooms once used as apartments. I climbed the narrow staircase and began flipping off switches one by one, mindlessly making my way through each space. But as I approached the hallway that always made me uncomfortable, I became more alert. The hallway was long and narrow, flanked by dark offices, and at the far end was a single string hanging from the ceiling, attached to the light. I reached for it, and, with a quick tug, plunged the hallway into darkness. That's when I heard it. A soft grunt, barely a breath, like the last exhale from a dying body. It came from behind me. The sound was so gentle and so unexpected that for a moment I doubted myself. But then my body reacted before my mind did. My muscles locked. A wave of dread pulsed through me like ice. Every instinct screamed at me not to turn around. Whatever was there, whatever had made that sound, I knew that if I looked at it, something terrible would happen. I didn't want to see it. I didn't want it to know I had heard it. Fueled by pure adrenaline, I ran. I didn't stop to look back. I bolted down the stairs, lungs tight, heart slamming against my ribs. I sprinted into the surveillance room, hoping my sister would be there, needing to feel her presence, but the room was empty. Panic surged again. I turned to the wall of monitors, scanning desperately for movement. And there she was, on one of the screens, walking down the staircase I had just fled, wearing her coat and holding a mop. Leaf washed over me. She must have followed me up there as a prank, I thought. It was something she would do. She loved scaring me, and I always fell for it. I collapsed onto the couch in the room, laughing a little at myself, the fear beginning to melt into embarrassment. When my sister and Mum returned to the kitchen, I told them about the scare, expecting laughter or playful teasing, but they just looked at me, confused. My sister furrowed her brow and said she hadn't left the kitchen. She'd been with our mum the entire time. I laughed, certain she was joking, and told her I'd seen her on the surveillance screen, her coat, her hat, the mop in her hand. My sister's face grew serious. I took off my coat the second we came in, she said softly, and I haven't put it back on since. I felt a chill then. A silence fell over the three of us. The idea that I had seen something or someone on the monitor that wasn't my sister crawled under my skin. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself the footage might have been delayed or that I had imagined it under stress. But I knew what I saw. It wasn't a blur or a shadow. It was her exact form. Except it wasn't her. We finished cleaning and packed up in silence. In the car, my sister whispered, "Do you know what a doppelganger is?" I shook my head. She explained, an exact double of a living person, sometimes seen as an omen or a warning. I didn't reply. I just stared out the window. I've replayed that night in my mind so many times. I've tried to convince myself that I was overtired, or that maybe it was some kind of glitch in the cameras. But that doesn't explain the sound. The breath behind me. The overwhelming sense that something was standing inches away. I've wondered what would have happened if I had turned around. Would I have seen myself? Would I have seen something else, something wearing my sister's face but not her soul? I don't know. And maybe it's better that way. Some questions are better left unanswered. 6. Sumi. My father has always been a rational man. He believes in hard work, discipline, and clear thinking. He rarely lets emotions cloud his judgment, and throughout my life, he's carried himself with a kind of steady calm that made people feel safe around him. But there's one story he told me that he's never been able to explain. It happened in 1982, when he was just 13 years old, living in the Philippines and attending a Roman Catholic seminary in Quezon City called Christ the King Missionary Seminary. The seminary was strict and serene, a place meant to groom young men for the priesthood. But not everyone stayed on that path, and my dad eventually chose a different life. Part of that decision, he once told me, came from what happened during those strange days at the seminary. My dad had a tight group of friends there, John, Rob, Richard, and Nick. None of them ended up becoming priests, but during that time they lived and studied together, bonding through classes, chores, and evening prayers. The seminary was known for its spiritual rigor, and students were warned early on that strange things sometimes happened within its walls. They were told that evil sometimes tried to test the faithful, that it didn't like young minds training to serve a higher purpose. Most kids brushed it off as folklore meant to keep them in line, but for my dad and his friends, it became real one night after Nick caught the flu. Nick had been quarantined in the infirmary for 2 days, standard procedure, but when he returned, he wasn't the same. My dad noticed it immediately. Nick was quiet, withdrawn. He sat at the dining table with his head down, saying nothing while everyone else joked and laughed. His eyes were often fixed on a window, his expression distant, as if he were listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. One day, during lunch, silent tears began to fall from Nick's eyes. No sound, no explanation, just quiet crying. Concerned, the group reported it to one of the seminary regents. The regent took Nick aside and asked what was going on. At first, Nick said nothing. Then in a whisper, he confessed that a man had been following him, not in the halls or the yard, but from somewhere else. When asked to describe the man, Nick said he wore jeans, had no shirt, and, most disturbingly, no face, just smooth skin where features should be. As soon as he said this out loud, something in him snapped. He broke down completely, begging for help, shouting that he didn't want to see the man anymore. The regent and others had to physically restrain him. After calming him with prayer, they assured Nick he was safe and let him rest, but things would only escalate from there. My dad tried to believe it was all stress-induced. Maybe Nick had been overwhelmed by the pressure of seminary life, but that night changed everything. It was late. The boys were in their dorm, setting up mosquito nets and getting ready for bed. My dad, Nick, and Richard had beds next to each other. Suddenly, Nick started screaming. "Get away from me," he yelled, swinging his arms violently at something invisible, and then, before anyone could react, his head jerked backward, hard, like he'd been punched in the jaw. His body flew backward through the air and hit the ground. My father said it was unlike anything he had ever seen. There was no way Nick could have jumped back that far or flung himself like that. He didn't bend his knees. It was as if something unseen had struck him and thrown him. For a few seconds, everyone in the dorm froze, staring in disbelief. Then they ran to call the regent. Nick was unconscious. The regent, the prefect, and a priest carried him to the office. My dad and a few of his friends, gripped by fear and curiosity, followed. Inside the office, the air felt heavy. Everyone present looked afraid, even the priest. They began praying over Nick, asking for protection and clarity. My dad and his friends joined in, holding rosaries and chanting with trembling voices. Halfway through the prayer, something even stranger happened. John, one of the boys, began speaking in gibberish. His eyes rolled back, and the words coming from his mouth didn't make sense. He spoke in what sounded like a different language, fast, harsh, urgent. Then, just as suddenly, he collapsed. The priest caught him before his head hit the floor. When John came to, he seemed confused, as if waking from a deep sleep. He had no memory of what he'd said, no idea why he'd fainted. The prayers continued, and the room felt like it was teetering on the edge of something dangerous and unseen. Eventually, Nick stirred and slowly regained consciousness, but he said nothing. The regent decided to let the boys return to their dorms while they kept Nick overnight under supervision. That walk back to the dorm was the quietest my father had ever experienced. No one spoke. The dorm, usually filled with late-night chatter and jokes, was as silent as a grave. That night, my dad shared a bed with his friend Reggie, both of them too shaken to sleep alone. He remembers how badly they trembled, their fear so intense the bed frame shook. Neither of them slept. In the morning, Nick was gone. His parents had taken him home for a 2-week break. When he returned, he was back to normal, laughing, talking like nothing had happened. No one ever brought it up again. It was as if a curtain had been pulled down over those events. Life at the seminary returned to routine, but for my dad and his friends, things had changed. Years passed. Nick drifted away from the group over unrelated issues. John, however, stayed a close family friend. Every now and then my dad brings up the incident and they talk about it. Not with fear, but with a shared uncertainty. My father still tries to rationalize it. Maybe Nick had a breakdown. Maybe John's outburst was a panic response. But none of it fits neatly. And that moment, when he saw his friend thrown by an unseen force, remains untouched by reason. Some memories age with us. They dull, lose their shape, become manageable. But not this one. My father still speaks of it with the same tone, quiet, hesitant, respectful, as if the memory isn't just something he lived through, but something that still watches from the edges of belief, waiting to be understood. Or perhaps, never to be. I work at a nursing home in Alberta, Canada. It's a quiet job, often lonely during late shifts, but I took it because I needed something steady. I'm pregnant, and ever since my husband passed away in a tragic car accident, a drunk driver struck him on the way home the same night I was planning to tell him about the baby, I've had to be strong for both of us. I work alone most nights, cleaning the kitchens, dining rooms and laundry area. The facility is large, old, and somewhat eerie even on the best of days, especially the eastern wing, which hasn't been renovated in decades. It's not just the peeling wallpaper or the dim hallway lights that unsettle me. There's something else in that part of the building, something I can't explain. It started one night when I was cleaning the first dining room. Everything was going as usual until a terrible odor hit me. Thick, sour, and unmistakably rotten. I thought maybe someone had forgotten to take out the trash, but when I checked the bins, they were all clean. The smell grew stronger as I moved past the kitchen and into the hallway of the east wing. The hallway was quiet. Most rooms were unoccupied. Only 5 residents lived in this part of the building. I followed the scent down the corridor until it led me to room 218, a room I knew was empty. I had cleaned it before. There was no furniture, no resident, nothing. The smell coming from behind the door was unbearable. I assumed the day shift staff had left a bag of spoiled food or trash inside. With my master key, I unlocked the door and stepped into the room. Immediately, I felt the air change. It was icy cold, like the AC had been blasting for hours. The temperature drop took my breath away. There was no furniture inside, no belongings, no source for the odor, just an empty room. And that unshakable sense that I wasn't alone. I left quickly, locking the door behind me and making a note to report it. But as I walked away, I heard a knock, loud and heavy, coming from inside the room. I froze. My body went cold. Then the knock came again, twice as loud. I turned and stared at the door. There was no one else around. No one could have slipped in without me seeing. My instincts screamed at me to run, and I did. I dashed down the hall, heart pounding, until I reached the kitchen phone. I dialed 911, convinced that someone had broken in. The dispatcher said an officer was nearby and would arrive within minutes. When he did, I led him to room 218. He checked it thoroughly. The room was locked, the windows were secure, and the smell? Gone. He looked at me like I was just another overworked night staffer imagining things. I wanted to believe that too, but I knew what I'd experienced. And that was only the beginning. Another night, not long after, I was folding laundry in the facility's laundry room. The machines were humming, and I was lost in my thoughts. The room has large windows, and at night they reflect the interior like mirrors. I happened to glance up and saw someone behind me. An elderly man with a pale face, bald head, and hollow black eyes was staring at me in the reflection. I turned sharply, but no one was there. My heart raced. I searched the room and the hallway outside. Nothing. It felt like my skin didn't fit right anymore. I finished folding as fast as I could, locked the laundry room and turned to head back toward the staff room. That's when I saw him again, standing at the end of the hallway. He looked exactly as he had in the reflection. Tall. Old. Wearing jeans and a tucked-in white t-shirt. His smile was too wide, almost proud. He didn't speak. He didn't move. I swallowed my fear and greeted him as calmly as I could, asking if he needed help. He didn't respond, just kept smiling. I forced a polite goodbye and hurried away, but the moment I sat down in the staff room, the phone rang. I looked at the caller ID, room 218. I hadn't seen anyone enter that room. It was still supposed to be empty. My stomach turned. I picked up the phone, hesitantly. "Hello?" I said. What came through wasn't a voice. It was a low, inhuman growl, followed by static, then silence. I repeated my greeting, my voice trembling. No response. Just the tone as the line disconnected. I sat there frozen for a long time, unsure what to do. Eventually, I knew I had to follow protocol. I walked back down the hallway toward room 218, forcing myself forward. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. My hand trembled as I turned the knob and pushed the door open. Empty. The smell was back. That same rotting stench filled the air. I stepped inside, calling out, trying to stay composed. And then I heard it. A laugh. So deep and guttural it didn't sound human. It echoed through the room, stabbing into my ears like knives. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't close the door. I ran until I reached the main staff room. I didn't leave that chair until my shift ended. I should have quit then. I should have walked out and never looked back, but I couldn't. I was alone, pregnant. I needed the job. My options were limited, and so I kept coming back. Each shift after that I felt it more, the pressure, the presence, the unspoken warning that lingered in that wing. I never stayed near room 218 unless absolutely necessary. I tried not to look down that hallway, but sometimes I could feel eyes on me from the darkness. Some nights I still dream of that man's face, that knowing smile, that laugh. I don't know what I saw or what I heard, but I know it was real. I'm not a superstitious person, I never was, but whatever lives in that room, whatever walks those halls in the dead of night, it's not one of us, and it's not resting. I still have more stories from that place, more nights that chilled me to the core, but for now I just needed to share this one, to remind myself that I didn't imagine it, that something out there saw me, and I saw it too. I run a small bed and breakfast in the UK. I've hosted hundreds of guests, travellers, tourists, and the occasional eccentric loner. But I've always believed that hospitality means making everyone feel safe and welcome. That belief was tested last summer, during the final weeks of tourist season. It was a busy time. All 7 rooms were occupied. A foreign couple with their baby had taken one, 2 girls from Australia were staying in another, and in the attic room we had a lone man, quiet, distant, and immediately unsettling. I've always trusted my gut, and from the moment he walked in, I felt something off. His long, greasy hair, dirty fingernails, and heavy silence set him apart. But I reminded myself, looks can be deceiving. I welcomed him like everyone else. The first night passed without incident. I stayed in my hobby room most of the evening watching television. Around 9:30 p.m, I decided to go upstairs to my bedroom and unwind with a few videos on my laptop. It was a quiet night, the kind where you can hear your own breathing. Just as I was beginning to relax, there was a knock on my door. But this wasn't just a knock. It was forceful, aggressive, like whoever stood outside was trying to break the rhythm of the house. I walked slowly to the door and looked through the peephole. It was the man from the attic room. He didn't wait for me to speak. The moment I opened the door, he began rambling. He said a pipe in his room had burst and water was flooding the floor. He needed help. I nodded quickly and followed him up the narrow staircase to the attic. My focus was on being professional, calming, trying not to escalate anything unnecessarily. But the moment I stepped into his room, a sick feeling bloomed in my chest. He shut the door behind me and locked it. That's when I realized there were no pipes in the attic. It hit me all at once. There's no bathroom in the attic, no sink, no plumbing that could burst, and worse, the room was dry, not a drop of water anywhere. The man turned toward me slowly, and I saw the way his eyes gleamed, not with panic, but anticipation. I stepped backward, looking for an escape, and that's when I saw the handle of a knife sticking out from his jacket pocket. He reached for it. Without thinking, I bolted. I ducked past him, shoved the door open and raced down the stairs. I could hear him behind me, his feet pounding against the steps. When I reached the second floor, I heard him stop, retreating. I didn't wait. I locked myself in my room and immediately called the police. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number. Then I called the other guests, one by one, telling them to lock their doors and not open them for anyone. By the time the police arrived, the house was quiet again. The man hadn't fled. He was hiding in his room, crouched inside the wardrobe like a predator waiting to strike. The officers handcuffed him and took him away. I'll never forget what they found in his backpack: duct tape, a Stanley knife, a screwdriver, and a few other items I won't describe. You can imagine. It was clear he hadn't just come to rest for the night. He had a plan. After they took him away, I sat in silence for a long time, numb. My body was safe, but my mind was in pieces. I kept seeing his face, how calm he had been, how rehearsed his story sounded. I thought about how easily I could have believed him a little longer. Just 5 more minutes. Just one more misstep. The thought sent shivers through me. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think any of my guests did either. The next morning, the 2 Australian girls quietly checked out. The couple with the baby said nothing, but I saw the unease in their eyes. And me? I kept playing it over in my head, trying to find the moment I should have known better. But the truth is, people like him know how to wear a mask. Since that night, I've taken extra precautions. New locks, new security systems, but no amount of technology can fully erase what happened. The real damage was done to my sense of safety in my own home. Every creak of the stairs at night feels louder now. Every late check-in makes my pulse race. I've considered moving, starting fresh somewhere else, but part of me refuses to let fear dictate my life. Still, I wonder, he knew where I lived. He saw my face. He could come back someday. That's the part that haunts me most. What terrifies me isn't just what almost happened, it's how close I came to ignoring my instincts, how close I came to trusting a stranger who smiled and lied and locked the door behind me. I've met many people while running this bed and breakfast. Most are kind, curious, harmless. But now, no matter how warm someone seems, I listen carefully to that quiet voice inside me, the one that whispered something was wrong long before I could see it, because that voice, that feeling, is what saved my life. Night story. My grandmother's house was always a strange place. It was old, tucked away in a quiet, rural town, and filled with the scent of lavender, dust, and something else I could never name. I spent countless weekends there as a child, running up and down the creaky wooden stairs, chasing shadows that seemed to move just a second too slow. It wasn't just the creaking floors or the antique furniture that made the house feel strange. It was the air itself. It felt thick in certain rooms, as if you had to push through it. My grandmother never spoke of anything odd, but her eyes always seemed to watch the corners more than the center of the room. And once, when I asked her why the attic door was always locked, she simply replied, "It's best left alone." I didn't think much of it until I was older, around 16, and my parents left me at her place for a few days while they travelled. She had grown frailer by then, but her mind was still sharp. The first night, I helped her prepare dinner, we played cards, and she turned in early. I stayed up in the living room reading, the soft tick of the grandfather clock filling the silence. At some point I noticed something odd. The attic door was open, not just cracked, but wide open. I stared at it from the couch, unsure whether I was more curious or afraid. I'd never seen it unlocked before. Eventually I stood up, drawn to it as though something called me. The staircase was narrow and steep, the air cooler the higher I climbed. When I reached the top, the light flickered as I pulled the chain to turn it on. The attic was filled with old trunks, moth-eaten coats and boxes that hadn't been touched in years. At the far end of the room was a mirror, tall and old-fashioned, with a thin veil draped over it. As I stepped closer, I noticed something in the glass, not my reflection exactly, but a darker version of me. The face looked like mine, but it wasn't moving as I did. It just stared, expressionless. I blinked and stepped back, heart pounding. When I looked again, the reflection was normal. Just me, pale and shaken. I left the attic quickly, turning the light off and pulling the door closed behind me. I didn't tell my grandmother. I didn't want to worry her, or worse, make her think I was mocking something she may have always known. That night, I locked my bedroom door and slept with the covers up to my chin. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a faint sound, soft tapping on the window. I sat up, confused. The window overlooked the backyard and we were on the second floor. No trees nearby, no birds at that hour. I got up and peeked through the curtain. Nothing, just the faint shimmer of dew on the glass. I turned back toward the bed, and that's when I saw it, my reflection in the window. But I wasn't standing in front of it anymore, and the face in the glass was still looking directly at me. It smiled, slowly, deliberately. I backed away, breath caught in my throat, and turned on the light. When I looked again, the window showed nothing but my own frightened face. The smile was gone. The moment passed, but I couldn't shake it. I'd barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning I tried to act normal. My grandmother made breakfast, humming softly like always, and I sat at the table trying not to look tired. She paused while pouring tea and asked, "Did you go into the attic?" I hesitated, then nodded. She didn't scold me. She didn't even sound surprised. She just sighed and said, "That mirror was your grandfather's. He brought it back from somewhere far. After he passed, I kept it covered. Some things reflect more than just light." I didn't know what to say. Her words weren't meant to frighten me. They were said gently, like a warning offered too late. The rest of my stay passed quietly. I avoided the attic, and the door stayed shut. But each night, I heard the same tapping at the window, always around the same time. I stopped looking. I didn't want to know if the reflection was still wrong. I counted down the hours until my parents returned, and when they finally picked me up, I hugged my grandmother goodbye and promised to visit soon. But I never stayed overnight again. I loved her. I missed her. But the house had changed for me. Or maybe I had finally seen it for what it was. Years later, after my grandmother passed away, the house was left to my mother. She didn't want it, so we went to pack it up for sale. The attic was still locked. The mirror was still there, still covered. My mother asked me to help carry it out to the truck. As we lifted it, the veil slipped, and for just a second, I looked into the glass. My reflection looked back, but my face didn't match the expression I was making. It was smiling again. That same slow, knowing smile. I dropped my end of the mirror. It cracked, not shattered, but enough to blur the face behind the glass. I never touched it again. We left the mirror in the house. The new owners removed it eventually. I don't know where it ended up. I try not to think about it, but sometimes at night, when the world is quiet and my room is dim, I'll catch a glimpse of my reflection in the window or the mirror, and for just a heartbeat, it doesn't quite match. Just enough to make me wonder. Just enough to remember that old house, that attic door, and the reflection that smiled before I ever did. In Storden. It happened during my final year of high school. I had taken a part-time job as a night cleaner at a small neighborhood church just outside of town. It was a quiet, mostly empty place, with old stone walls and stained glass windows that cast haunting patterns even in the moonlight. The work was simple. Vacuum the main chapel, tidy the pews, dust the altar, and lock up by midnight. I was grateful for the solitude. After a long day of school and dealing with people, the silence of the church felt like peace. But looking back, I think the silence may have been watching me, just as much as I enjoyed escaping into it. The first few weeks were uneventful. Occasionally I'd hear a creak or the sound of wood settling, but nothing that struck me as unusual in a 100-year-old building. One night, though, As I was sweeping near the altar, I heard what sounded like footsteps behind me. They were soft, measured, almost deliberate, moving from the back of the church toward the front. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone who had wandered in, but the aisle was empty. I stood there, broom in hand, listening. Nothing. I chalked it up to my imagination, a trick of echoes. I went back to sweeping. But the next night the footsteps returned. This time they stopped just before the altar. I didn't turn around immediately. I just froze, suddenly aware of how vulnerable I was, just me and the echo of someone who wasn't there. When I finally turned, again there was no one. But the air felt colder. The hair on my arms stood up. I left early that night, locking up with trembling fingers and telling myself I was just tired, but it didn't stop. Each night, the sound came back, always the same pacing footsteps. Sometimes they stopped behind me. Other times, I'd hear them run down the aisle and vanish. Then one evening, I saw something. I was wiping down the front pews when I noticed movement in the stained glass reflection on the floor. At first, I thought it was my own shadow, but then I realized I wasn't moving, and yet the shadow was. It glided across the floor, tall and thin, pausing right at the edge of the light where the altar steps began. I turned around, heart pounding. No one. But when I looked back at the reflection, the shadow was gone. I remember standing there for a long moment, trying to breathe slowly, pretending the fear wasn't tightening around my throat. A few days later, I decided to bring a friend with me. I didn't tell him everything, just said the place creeped me out and I didn't like working alone anymore. He agreed, mostly out of boredom. We cleaned together, joked around, and the night was mostly quiet, until we both heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone walking quickly up the side aisle. My friend froze mid-conversation and looked at me, his smile fading. We turned together and saw nothing. But then we heard the wooden door at the back of the church creak open, slowly, like someone was just stepping in or out. He asked if anyone else had keys. I said no, it was just us. He didn't say much after that. The next day, he told me he didn't want to come back. He wasn't angry, just unsettled. I understood. I kept working alone, but my routines changed. I stopped staying late. I rushed through the cleaning. I kept the lights on in every room. One night, as I was locking the back door, I saw a figure standing at the far end of the chapel. Tall, cloaked in shadow, watching me. I blinked. And it was gone. Not vanished, just gone, like it had never been there. But I knew what I saw. I asked the pastor if there had ever been anything unusual in the church's history. He smiled gently, like I was a child asking about monsters under the bed. All buildings hold memories, he said. And churches, well, they're full of people's hopes and grief. Sometimes those things linger. I didn't know what to say to that. It wasn't an answer, but it wasn't a denial either. I finished my final month quietly. Nothing dramatic happened after that, but the sense of being watched never faded. Even on the last night, when I turned off the lights for the final time, I could feel it, something waiting in the dark behind the pews. I left the keys on the altar as instructed and stepped out into the cold night. I didn't look back at the building. I didn't want to. Some part of me believed that if I looked back, I'd see someone standing in the doorway, a shadow that didn't belong to me, a presence that had watched me for weeks, maybe even longer. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away without glancing in the rearview mirror. I've never been back to that church, not even during the day. I tell myself it was just an old building with creaky floors and too many stories caught in its walls. But sometimes, in my dreams, I'm back there, standing alone in the dark, with footsteps echoing all around me. And I wake up with the cold still clinging to my skin, wondering if something followed me home.